Chapter 3 Castle Life. Pondhopper did not sleep well that night. She had spent ages trying to get out of her prison, but all of her efforts proved insufficient. Her teeth were too small to make any meaningful progress chewing through the bars, and ultimately only resulted in giving her sore gums. Attempts at breathing fire on the cage to escape were similarly fruitless. She had only managed to hack up a small spray of sparks and a puff of acrid smoke, which the princess found absolutely delightful. If only for the sake of preserving what little remained of her dignity, Pondhopper elected not to try that again. Her claws were sharp, yes, but the cage was sturdy, and trying to rip through it had only gotten her claws stuck in the bars, leaving her helpless until the princess helped her get unstuck. Having exhausted her most obvious options, Hopper retreated to the back corner of her little cage, gathered together the coins the princess had given her, curled up into a little ball, and fell into a fitful slumber. She was occasionally jarred out of her sleep by bad dreams or unfamiliar sounds echoing from outside. The calls of horses, the metallic scraping of the night watch on patrol, and some weird chanting that sounded oddly jovial. And all the while, she wondered, how long would she be here? How long would she have to wait before her mother came to bust her out? Surely Swordfish had made it back home and let her know what had happened, right? Except, he had left before Hopper had been captured. As far as anyone knew, she had just vanished into thin air. Such thoughts were the only company she had for the longest time. At last, though, the darkness of the night was banished by the coming of the dawn. Streams of warm sunlight filtered in through the princess's bedroom window. The rising light worked wonders in chasing away Hopper's grogginess. Soon enough, the princess began to stir in her bed, letting out a few quiet murmurs. Pondhopper let off a hateful snort, but said nothing. Soon, the woman sat upright in her bed, her face the picture of not a morning person. Her hair had gone from elegantly combed to wild and scattered. Hopper felt like she might get a static shock just by looking at her. The princess's tired eyes then turned to Hopper in her cage and lit up in a way that made Hopper want to puke.
Pinky! Good morning!
The princess greeted with far too much energy.
Pondhopper?
The princess ignored the correction and clambered out of her bed clumsily. She skipped to the cage and knelt before it, giving Hopper a large grin.
Oh, you're so cute curled up like that. I'm not... Oh, forget it.
What would be the point? The human clearly did not care what she had to say.
Is somebody a little Miss Grumpy Pants today?
The princess asked, batting her eyelashes at Hopper.
I will eat your entire family.
Once again, the princess giggled at her.
Oh, Pinky, be nice.
Pondhopper growled low in her throat, her tail lashing angrily about. She opted not to say anything else for now. She sat up on her makeshift hoard, holding her head high to try and at least project an air of dignity. There was a sharp knocking at the door a moment later, drawing the princess's attention. Pondhopper followed her gaze to see none other than the plump king himself coming into the room, followed shortly by a well-armored soldier. A bodyguard, no doubt. The king beamed. "Good morning, my dear. How is your new pet?" he asked, swallowing his daughter up in a bone-crushing hug when she hurled herself at him.
She's doing great, Daddy,
the princess squealed. She turned and pointed ecstatically at Hopper.
Look, she's already made herself a little pile.
The king quirked a brow. So she has. Hopper scowled at the two of them before turning her attention to the soldier that stood behind the king. He was a tall man, his face obscured by a remarkably ornate helmet. She could just make out the glint of his eyes through the slits in his visor. He was glaring back at her, his eyes reflecting a similar hatred to her own. The king turned his attention back to the princess. "Well, come along, get ready. We have a lot to do today, and the seamstress wanted to speak with you about your request," he said, patting his daughter on the shoulder. The princess turned back to Hopper.
But I don't want to leave Pinky all alone in here. What if she gets lonely? Oh no, please, by all means.
Hopper droned sarcastically.
Dragons don't get lonely. If they did, why would we sleep far away from you smelly humans in deep dark caves?
The princess clasped her hands to her mouth.
You live in such dreadful places? Why, however do you not go mad?
Pondhopper's expression flattened further. She was fairly certain her sanity was beginning to slip.
Gee, it's a mystery.
The princess, undeterred, turned back to the king.
Can she not come with me around the castle, Daddy? I want her to see her new home.
Hopper gagged violently. The king stroked his beard for a second. Well... The soldier behind the king abruptly cleared his throat, drawing the attention of both royals. Your Majesties, if I may, I am not comfortable with allowing a dragon to wander freely around the keep.
Heaven forbid you do,
Hopper thought.
Might give me a chance to escape.
The king nodded in agreement. Quite right. Your new pet or no, she is still new to the castle, and the servants have yet to be informed. The princess pawed at the king's shoulder.
But she can't just stay in the cage. I haven't even got her a litter box yet. A what?
The princess carried on.
Can we at least let her roam around the room outside?
The king continued stroking his chin, and Hopper couldn't help but wonder if he thought it made him look smart. Well, it might help her acclimatize to a new home if she got the lay of the land a little bit, and if it makes you happy. A second later, the king turned and rapped on the soldier's chest plate with his fist, drawing his attention. Well then, Hugo, I'm tasking you with keeping an eye on our new resident. The soldier, Hugo, recoiled. I beg your pardon, sire. We'll let little Pinky here have the run of the common room right outside this one. It'll keep her occupied, keep her busy, and I am entrusting you to make sure she doesn't get into any trouble. Hugo stood more upright. Your Highness, I have several objections.
Not as many as I do,
Hopper called over to him. You stay out of this.
I am literally the subject of the conversation.
The princess, ever an oblivious thing, clapped her hands in delight.
Yay! Thank you, Daddy,
she cheered, before giving him another hug. The king chuckled, patting her on the back. Anything for you, my dear. Now go on, freshen up. Hugo and I have things handled.
Okay,
the princess chirped before sprinting out of the room, leaving Hopper alone with the king and his knight. Hugo turned to the king more directly, and Hopper could literally feel the tone shift in the room. Sire, a moment. The king nodded, and the two slipped out of the room to speak. Hopper, curious, left her hoard and came up to the bars of her cage. The two were talking in hushed whispers, low enough that feeble human ears might not have been able to make out the words. But Pondhopper was a dragon. Picking out their words was a simple thing for her. Sire, are you certain it is wise to allow this thing within our walls? Hugo asked. I know the princess finds it cute, but it is still a dragon. These foul beasts have been our mortal enemies since time immemorial. It is merely a hatchling, the king assured him. A whelp, tiny and small. The puny little thing couldn't even wrestle out of a bundle of capes, and it cannot breathe flames as of yet. Hugo was not convinced. Your Majesty, even a hatchling can be exceedingly dangerous. Don't you remember what happened to your son? There was a pause. When the king answered, his voice had lowered significantly. Why do you think I am indulging her in this? He asked gravely. Pondhopper frowned.
The king has a son too?
Or, well, had a son, she supposed. The way they were talking about him, it sounded like the poor fool had gone after another hatchling, no doubt thinking it would be easy prey. Sire, the creature is small, and you know my daughter. She will tire of the thing soon enough. When she has, then we may dispose of it. A spike of adrenaline shot through Pondhopper's veins. As surely as she was frightened by the prospect, though, she couldn't help but feel a small little twinge of excitement. She recalled with vivid clarity a speech given to her by one of her elders back in the crags.
Your quest as a dragon is to demolish mountains and set cities ablaze, to bring death and destruction everywhere you go. And if you are lucky enough, you will be slain in a mighty battle by a heroic knight, and all that shall remain of you is a tale of power and glory.
She had been so ecstatic when she had heard this.
That is so cool!
She had shouted. Fighting a knight as her dying act, cementing her legacy for all time. The mere idea thrilled her in a way she couldn't describe. But she hadn't really thought that she would be facing that fate so soon. The conversation continued outside. But until then, you will let her have this. Do I make myself clear, Hugo? Hugo was quiet for a moment, then let out a huff. Very well, sire, if that is your wish. She heard armored footsteps approaching. Pondhopper quickly retreated back to her previous position on her hoard and sat upright, closing her eyes. When she heard the duo coming back into the room, she opened them to glare at the new arrivals. Hugo approached her cage and knelt down to it. He met her gaze through the bars. The two just stared at each other for a second before Hugo lifted the roof off her cage. Out. And don't try anything.
I don't take orders from you.
Hopper snipped, hopping up and out of the makeshift pen. She contemplated darting for the window, but the sight of Hugo's hand on the hilt of his sword made her think better of it. No, you take orders from Her Majesty, and I enforce her orders. Pondhopper turned to face him, a smirk creeping across her face.
Oh, big words coming from a puny little human.
So says the worm pretending to be a great dragon, Hugo shot back. Pondhopper's smirk grew into a full-on grin.
I like you.
Hugo's eyes narrowed behind his visor. And I hate you.
Cool.
While it was hard to tell through that visor, Pondhopper was fairly certain Hugo's eye twitched in response to that. She chose to believe that it had before sauntering past him, head and tail held high, out through the door. If she was going to play their silly little game, she was going to maintain her dignity, darn it! The room outside the princess's quarters was round and surprisingly large. Pondhopper paused for a moment to look around. Several doors were set into the walls, though where they led was a mystery. The floor was covered in plush red carpeting, and Hopper had to resist the urge to start kneading then and there. An ornate chandelier hung overhead, filling the room with gently flickering light. The walls were lavishly decorated with paintings in between ornamental sets of armor. What drew Hopper's eyes the most, however, was the modest round wooden table that sat on the far end of the room from the princess's chamber. A plate, loaded with fresh-looking fruits and vegetables, was placed there, alongside a glass of water. Laying eyes on the food made Hopper's stomach rumble, and she realized with a grimace that she hadn't eaten anything since she had set out to catch the princess. Hugo came up behind her. As the princess wills it, you are free to explore this chamber. But if you even think of venturing beyond it... Hey! Hopper ignored him, and swiftly strode across the room for the table. With a quick flutter of her wings and a tiny grunt of effort, she sprang up onto the surface. With a hiss of hunger, she pounced on the plate and immediately chomped onto the first fruit she saw. She would have preferred raw meat, of course, but hey, if Swordfish could eat spring onions, she could have a pair. At least that was what her bravado told her. Her tongue, on the other hand, now told her that she was a big dumb stupid head with all of the brains of a dried turnip. The taste of the pear was rancid to her draconic taste buds. She almost instantly stood bolt upright, her tail ramrod straight behind her while her eyes went wide. She stood there, frozen like a statue, keenly aware of the two pairs of human eyes that were watching her from across the room. She refused to show any weakness. And so, rather than spit out the foul substance as her tummy was begging her to do, she inhaled deeply through her nose and swallowed. Ugh, it went down like a lump of coal, and probably a lump of coal would have tasted better. But she managed to suppress a shudder. She went to take a step back, eager to be away from this rot the humans called food, but stopped mid-step. She was still being watched. If they saw her take one bite of their food and then just leave... A door opened behind her, interrupting her train of thought.
Oh, and Daddy, could you...
The princess began before suddenly cutting off with a sharp gasp.
No! Bad, Pinky! Get off the table!
Pondhopper froze in place, her already wide-eyed expression growing even wider.
Did that human woman give me an order? Did you just call me Bad Pinky?
It already ate one of your pears, Hugo noted with a snort. Funny. I thought dragons were supposed to be apex predators. Are you a vegetarian? Hopper's disbelief morphed into overwhelming rage. Every fiber of her tiny body screamed at her to get revenge for that insult, but she was quick to rein herself in. She was at every conceivable disadvantage here. If she wanted payback, she needed it to be satisfying, but small enough as to not draw a violent response. It was then that she recalled the cup of water. With a tiny snort of fury, Hopper plunged her paw into the water before kicking back, sending the cup flying off the table to shatter against the floor. She heard the princess gasp.
Pinky, why?
Hopper did not humor the question. Without a word, she leapt from the table, sinking her claws into the wood of a nearby cupboard, and slid down. The ear was filled with an obnoxious scraping as her claws tore impressive gouges into the cabinet's doors, earning irate noises from her captors. Their complaints were music to her ears. The king turned to the princess, who looked about ready to faint. Go wash up, honey. Hugo has things well in hand. Do I, your majesty? Do I really? Of course you do, the king said, thumping Hugo on the chest before striding past him. Now, I have business to tend to elsewhere. Don't forget the seamstress, dear. The princess's smile returned.
I won't.
With that, the princess vanished back into her washroom, and the king left the lounge, leaving Hopper alone with Hugo. There was a long pause and an awkward silence. Hopper's stomach rumbled again, and the pains of hunger became distinctly more noticeable. She stifled a groan of discomfort before turning to Hugo.
You. I'm hungry. Feed me.
Hugo blinked. I beg your pardon? What do you think I am, your slave? Hopper nodded.
Well, I'm supposed to be your dumb princess's pet, aren't I? So, yes. And I haven't had anything to eat since I got here, and your fruits make me sick. Now get me some meat.
Hugo's grip tightened on his sword. Don't you dare call the princess dumb, you foul wretched!
Hugo!
The princess's voice rang out from the washroom.
Be nice to Pinky!
Pondhopper couldn't help but snicker as feel a warm glow of victory as the poor knight spluttered. A moment passed before Hugo gave off a heavy sigh. Yes, Your Highness, he relented. He turned back to Hopper. I will summon a servant to bring you something from the kitchens, but it takes time to prepare.
Prepare? Please, just toss me a slab. I'll eat it raw.
Hopper dismissed, swishing her tail and turning to explore her environment some more.
Honestly, what is it with you humans and trying to cook everything?
Why do you dragons like to eat everything raw like feral savages? Hugo countered. Pondhopper snorted.
Because meat is better when it's fresh?
You are vile.
And you're still not feeding me.
Hugo gave a growl of agitation. Without another word, he stepped for the same door the king had slipped out of, though not before closing the princess's chambers and locking them up tight, removing any chance Hopper had of working a quick getaway while he was occupied. He leveled a finger at her as he passed. If you try anything at all,
you'll take my head and mount it on your wall, claim my stolen treasure, blah, 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 blah.
Hopper interrupted him, rolling her eyes.
Yeah, I've heard it all a dozen times. Now less talking, more feeding.
Hugo very clearly took a moment to collect himself. He took one deep breath, then another, before finally stepping out of the room and locking the door behind him, leaving Hopper all on her own. Her stomach growled again. She let off another puff of smoke.
Why don't they just have a dead deer lying around like Mom does?
She grumbled. Oh well, if she was going to be here for now, she might as well get familiar with her surroundings. Straightening out her posture, Hopper turned to continue exploring her new residence. Unfortunately, there is precious little for her to find in this one room, and with all of the doors locked, she basically had already seen everything there was to see. Still, she contented herself with sniffing around for a while, getting a feel for the place. It was only after she had been poking around for several minutes that she heard something move above her. Alarmed, she looked up just in time to see a shadowy figure jump down from the rafters over her head. Fight-or-flight instincts immediately kicked in. Hopper arched her back and flared her wings, an involuntary hiss slipping past her fangs. But as the creature descended, Pondhopper realized it was far smaller than she was, to the point that she imagined she could fit it in her mouth. It moved with precise, graceful movements, leaping from the rafters, down to the cupboard she had ruined, to the table, and finally down to the floor. It had a similar build to the mountain lions she sometimes saw in the wilds around her mother's roost, but far smaller. It was covered in short black fur and had two enormous yellow eyes. Its proportions suggested to Pondhopper that it was young, a child, just like her. It laid its eyes on her and tilted its head, its long tail swishing curiously behind it. Its ears swiveled this way and that.
Meow.
Hopper eyed the creature for a few moments.
Hello?
She greeted cautiously. The creature approached her, a low rumbling noise emanating from its throat. Hopper took a step back at its approach, but its body language did not suggest hostility, just curiosity. It slowly blinked at her a few times as it approached. It questioned again. Hopper's expression flattened.
I take it you don't speak. Meow.
The creature came up to her and sat on its haunches. It looked up at her, its eyes all wide and buggy like that. It was cute. Hopper hated it. Her stomach growled again, and an idea came to her. She eyed the creature for several long seconds, scrunching up her scaly muzzle in thought.
You're hardly the weirdest thing I've ever met. And you'll hardly be the weirdest thing I'll ever have put in my mouth.
The creature blinked at her again.
Meow.
Pondhopper lifted her head up high, looking down at the thing over her nose.
Feel honored, tiny thing. Few are they who get to be eaten by a dragon. Meow.
And then Pondhopper opened her mouth wide and snapped it up with one swift bite, leaving nothing but a fluffy tail sticking out the corner of her lip. The creature let out a startled yell in her mouth, the sound muffled by her maw, but she was unperturbed. The fur of the creature was decidedly unpleasant, but she had eaten far fluffier things before, like sheep. Hopper was about to start chewing when the door to the princess's washroom swung open. Out came the princess, all clean and sparkly, with her hair done up in a towel bun. She was humming an aimless little melody to herself that made Hopper's ears sting. The princess cast her eyes about the room, smiling widely.
Meow.
The creature in Hopper's mouth loosed another meow, this one sounding fearful. The princess froze in place, and the humming went silent in her throat. Pondhopper held still, holding her breath.
Where is my cat?
The princess eventually asked. Pondhopper had to resist the urge to say something very rude just then. This creature must have been another one of the princess's little pets. With a sigh of frustration, Hopper spat the cat off to one side. It landed on its feet with no effort, though it immediately leaned back and away from Hopper with wide, horrified eyes. Hopper snorted at it.
Consider yourself lucky, you. The only reason I haven't eaten you is that you and I are both prisoners to her.
The cat stared at Hopper a moment longer. Then it ran away.
Aw, you met mittens.
The princess squealed as she saw her cat sprinting off.
She is such a nice kitty. She keeps all the yucky little rats and mice away.
Hopper gagged again. It was at this time that the door Hugo had left through opened back up. Hopper turned to look as he made his return, and her mouth watered at the sight and smell of a fresh cut of some manner of red meat. Meat for the mongrel, Hugo stated. He didn't even wait for Hopper to say anything. He just lobbed the slab of meat at her as if she were a rabid cur. It slapped fully against her face with a wet smack.
Hugo!
The princess chastised him, immediately rushing over to Hopper while shooting the knight a disapproving look.
I told you to be nice!
Hugo merely shrugged. The princess knelt down in front of Hopper.
Are you okay?
Hopper pried the meat off her face to glare up at her. There were a few little droplets of grease left on her face, but she didn't really care.
Absolutely perfect,
she deadpanned. The princess's face practically glowed.
Wonderful! Oh, but look at you. You've got grease all over your face. Here, let me.
Hopper blinked in confusion as the princess reached up to the towel wrapped around her head. Then she hissed as the princess began furiously scrubbing said towel over her face.
Ah! What the? Stop it!
She complained, though she was not able to get away from those irritatingly strong hands. What did this woman do? Push-ups? Thankfully, the suffering only lasted for a few seconds before the princess withdrew.
There you go, all clean.
Hopper shook her head and gave the princess a scowl. She opened her mouth to utter some manner of retort or snappy remark, but was interrupted by a smug snickering noise. It was coming from Hugo.
Is he laughing at me?
Hopper thought, as she turned her irate glare on him. She could see the satisfaction and amusement even through his visor. I'm not so sure, Your Highness, Hugo said, unable to hide the audible smile in his voice. Pinky was living out in the wilds for a long, long time. She might need a proper bath. The princess hummed.
Oh, maybe.
Hopper glared at the knight for a moment. Then, while maintaining very deliberate eye contact, she bit down on the slab of meat he had brought her. The wet squelching of rending meat filled the air, and she took her sweet time chewing. The mirth fled Hugo's face, and she saw his posture shift to something a little more defensive. The princess rose back to her feet.
Oh, but that will have to wait. The seamstress is still waiting for me,
she exclaimed, slapping her hands together.
Come on, Hugo.
Hugo turned to her. Ma'am, I cannot allow this creature, Pinky, to be left unsupervised. The princess deflated on the spot.
Oh, you're probably right.
Pondhopper clenched her jaw in frustration, but said nothing. The princess turned back to her.
I'm sorry, Pinky. Come on, let's get you back in your pen.
Hopper puffed out smoke from her nostrils.
If you think I'm going to let myself be stuffed into that undignified cage again, then you...
She began, but her words trailed off when she saw Hugo's hand silently wrapping around the hilt of his sword. That alone would have been enough to make her clam up and play along, for now. But adding insult to injury was the masterfully sad pout the princess gave her. She reminded Hopper of a little nestful of birdlings that had stolen from her hoard once. She had meant to take back the treasure they took, but when she'd seen the little chicks looking back up at her with those stupid, adorable eyes and her coins in their stupid, cute little beaks, she had just had to relent. And distressingly, it seemed the human princess had this same power over her. Hopper deflated and turned to start walking back for the pen.
Then you are absolutely right.
The princess's demeanor flipped right back to being bright and cheerful, just like that.
Yay! Don't worry, I'll bring you some presents later,
she exclaimed, swiftly opening the door to let Hopper through. Once Hopper was secured in her little cage, she was left alone for the next several hours. Not that she minded this. As a dragon, most of her spare time, when not playing or planning a swordfish, was spent napping on her hoard back home. Home. Her thoughts wandered back there, to her little mound of treasure and trinkets. It wasn't much, especially when compared to the legendary hoard her mother had managed to accumulate. But even if her little pile was paltry compared to those of her elders, it was still hers. She had fought tooth and claw for every last coin, pearl, ruby, and candle in it. Not like this pathetic smattering of coins the princess had deigned to offer her. While some small part of her was impressed that the foolish girl had made an effort to be so considerate, she was mostly just offended. There were barely enough coins to constitute a pile, much less a proper hoard, and most of it was silver. Silver! Silver was nice and all, but it was nothing compared to proper gold or even Avorix's massive collection of platinum. A single coin from her mother's hoard would put the meager collection Hopper now rested on to absolute shame. She couldn't help but snarl under her breath as her thoughts turned to her mother's hoard and the impressive reputation the great dragon had accumulated. It hounded Hopper's every step. No matter where she went or what she did, just about any dragon she met expected her to follow in Avorix's footsteps. And she would. She wanted to. Living up to Avorix's reputation, being a dragon whose name would live on in human legends for millennia, it was all she ever dreamed about. But it was impossible, even for her, to deny that sometimes all of the pressure and expectations got under her skin. Everything she did was scrutinized. Everything she did had to be the best it could be. She had to breathe the hottest fire. She had to crush tougher armor, collect bigger and better treasures. Maybe that was why she was so drawn to Swordfish. For all of his little tics and annoying habits, for how incredibly undragon-like he always was, he managed to be fun and interesting to hang around with. And he never judged her based on her mother's reputation. He never expected her to do anything more or less than just be his friend. Hopper curled up just a little tighter on the pile and pillow, loosing a sigh. She could really use that little guy right about now. The door to the princess's chamber suddenly squealed open, drawing Pondhopper's attention. She turned to see the princess herself sway into the room, hands folded behind her back, and her eyes alight with anticipation.
Hey, Pinky! Did you have a nice nap?
Hopper did not dignify that question with a response. Undeterred, the princess practically frolicked across the room before dropping into a squat by Hopper's pen.
Sorry I was gone for so long. Daddy needed some help with some things, and the seamstress took a lot of convincing.
Pondhopper narrowed her eyes. Again, she said nothing. Still unable to process the fact that Hopper wanted silence, the princess cracked an even bigger grin, somehow.
Anyway, I brought you a present, courtesy of the castle seamstress. I had it made just for you.
Pondhopper rolled her eyes. What could the princess possibly get her that would make for a good present? Save possibly for the keys to the castle so she could rob the treasury and get out of here. Of course, the seamstress wouldn't be able to provide something like that, would they? They dealt in all those stupid fabrics that the humans liked to wear.
Why do they wear clothes anyway?
Hopper wondered as the princess began to bring her hands out from behind her back.
Are they just, ashamed of their bodies or something? I mean, I can't blame them. They're so soft and squishy and... Oh no, she did not.
Hopper's line of thought ground to a despairing halt when the princess's present came into view. In one hand was a large blue ribbon, the color of the sky. In the other was a thick winter sweater, as golden as sunlight in the morning. And both were in Pondhopper's size.
I figured you must be cold, all naked and furless like that,
the princess explained.
So I thought I'd have you some clothes made. Not only will they help keep you warm, but you'll just look so cute with a big bow.
Pondhopper blinked once. Twice. Her eyes started twitching.
Help!
She squeaked, barely louder than a mouse, as the princess opened her pen.